So to introduce the next session
is me.
I'm going to introduce Eric Perot, the CEO of GreenBiz. Who knew?
Who knew? Yeah, hi. I am not John Markoff. I do not write for the New York Times. I am the CEO of GreenBiz. Chris Anderson's drone crashed on the way here, so unfortunately, we will not have our drones or Chris. However, I ran into Rob Bernard from Microsoft, who was conveying a really interesting story last night at our City Summit cocktail party, which I thought would be really worth sharing with you all. So please join me in welcoming Rob Bernard from Microsoft.
Thanks, Eric.
Rob is the Chief Environmental and City Strategist, recently announced. And I think that's what we're going to get to in this conversation. But I really thought it would be useful to start with some context about how you got to this journey. Sort of some of the steps that you've taken are pretty bold. We'll hear from Daryl Smith later this week. But I pick some of your biggest projects that you're the most proud of.
Oh, sure. So, I mean, I think the biggest thing we did, like for sustainability at the company, was really early on create a framework, right? And we said, hey, what do we stand for, right? So we're certainly a technology-driven company. We believe heavily in the science, and this was 6-7 years ago when there was a lot of, I'd say, more friction in the system about being forthright about the science. And we said, hey, we're going to enable efficiency in and through the use of information technology, be responsible in the way we run our business, and accelerate scientific research because we have a bunch of Microsoft researchers around the world working on environmental issues. So I say the key for almost everything that's come since then has been that framework, and including the moves that we just made in the last month around merging my team with our cities team. But I'd say that foundation was the key, and it led to a whole series of activities that we've done.
Yeah, when we were talking last night, what was really interesting is that the move that we'll discuss is Verge. I mean, when we launched Verge, we said we want to really convene an audience that wasn't previously getting together. It's really the largest companies in the world that are looking to reduce their carbon and have a more positive impact in the world. Cities, because cities is the right scale. Cities is the scale that, and we have 14 cities here that have committed to some very deep carbon reductions, 80% carbon reduction by 2050. And then the service providers, large and small, innovators, companies that STEM that weren't around several years ago, to Microsoft and Schneider, and that has been a really interesting journey. And the idea that technology can really accelerate sustainability is the thesis, the essence of Verge. So why don't we just go right into what's happening now at Microsoft around the cities moving to you?
So, well, there's a couple things that's happening. So we took this step back and we said, okay, we feel like we have a carbon neutral goal, right? So we're committed to carbon neutrality, and we buy and invest in PPAs and carbon offset projects and do all sorts of stuff that I think is really interesting, and it's been more innovative and led to a bunch of stuff in terms of our investments in our data centers and fuel cells. So we felt really good about the progress we were starting to make, and we're still, I'd say, still in our early stages. I mean, the reality is we have to offset with RECs, which means we don't have clean fuel sources in most of the places around the world. It just doesn't exist at scale. We've done a couple large 100 megawatt plus deals, but there's still a lot more to do, right? So we said, okay, but the data center division really has taken that on. And we have a colleague here, Jenna, who may be in the room from our data center team, and we're looking at how do we transform our infrastructure. But that team is off and running, right? And so I look at the role of a sustainability officer is not to do the work, but to get others to do the work who are more qualified, right? Like, I am not a data center expert. I understand how our data centers work, but it's much better to have a team of 6 people thinking about energy in our data center, right? So then we looked at sort of our facilities. You mentioned Daryl, and he's going to show you some stuff that, for those who haven't seen it, I think you're going to be really amazed, right? But he's a real estate expert, and so that's great. So he's driving that, and so it felt really good when you say, what's some of the best accomplishments? The best accomplishments is getting people in the domains across the company, our auto team, like everybody really absorbing the fact that sustainability is core and critical. So then the question was, well, what's the next natural frontier? And you said it. I mean, we've been working with you and with Joel. In fact, one of my first meetings when I took the job was with Joel. He came up to Microsoft, and we basically asked him for a lot of guidance and advice. And here we are 7 years later, and like you said, we said, well, the next frontier is really cities, right? 80%, depending what you read, but 80% of the world's energy, 70% of energy-related carbon emissions, and all sorts of stuff. It felt like the next natural step. So we, as part of all the sort of changes that have been happening at Microsoft and our new CEO and other stuff, we took the step back and said, why wouldn't we actually try to see if we can take this impact and this theory that we have, that sustainability and cities are totally intertwined, and actually see if that's true. Right? So we created about a year and a half ago, this CityNext initiative, and it focuses on a whole series of stuff, and we're now really injecting sustainability into the core of this program.
So how much of this is driven by the desire to sell more to cities versus reduce carbon?
Well, I think it's a combination of factors. So, it was really interesting. We had the cities sessions yesterday. And if you look at the unmet needs of the cities, it's the magnitude of wasted resources in energy, water, transportation. I mean, the list is very long. There's a massive opportunity for actually a whole ecosystem of both local software companies and global software companies. So our strategy is we're not going to create a water optimization software package for a city, right? Our goal is to get somewhere between 10 and 100 software companies at both big global international level. I mean, we have projects that we do with companies like Schneider Electric or Iconics or Itron or all sorts of big companies, but also to actually spark local software economy. Right? So the goal is, we'd love to see everybody using Azure and SQL in our platforms, because I actually believe they've got the best sort of analytic tools. But the real opportunity is to let this thing grow and blossom. I mean, we already have over 700 solutions around the world that are in the city's catalog.
Right. So do the city group now rolls into your group?
That's right.
I just want everyone to sort of process that, particularly sustainability officers. The interesting thing that we see at GreenBiz is this is a gross generalization, but you see companies that are a little more focused on the reputational side and having to do all the reporting, all the stuff that's really critical and essential. But this is a whole nother step of becoming part of the operation. What was that journey like within Microsoft? How did that all happen?
Yeah, it was really interesting. Like I said, we took a step back in light of all the organizational changes happening at Microsoft, and we said, well, where does it make the most sense? And we looked at half a dozen, if not more, areas. In fact, we looked at, a lot of our energy is in our data center, and a lot of our manufacturing is with the Nokia deal. And we looked at, we have this big carbon fund, and it's well over $10 million now, and we use it to place in investments all over the world. You could say, well, that's a financial responsibility and accountability. And all those things are true, but those were sort of back to my sort of thesis of those were things we were already doing. Right. I think we're doing them, with mixed results, some well, some we have a lot of room for improvement. But where's the new ground, right? And it just made sense that when you look at the biggest environmental challenges as a group, and there are many, but it's the origin of cities, right? So if we're not being really focused on cities, then we will never actually sort of on that first pillar of our sustainability strategy, which is enable resource efficiency in and through the use of information technology. I don't know how you actually do that if you're not highly relevant in cities. So we have to go to cities, right? And what was great is the company said, like many of the other things we've done around sustainability, let's go make that journey. Let's go see if we can go do that.
I want you to touch, because I'm not sure everyone, can you talk about that fund? The carbon tax, how did you get that fund?
So we looked at, goals, and in fact, it came up yesterday's meeting, 80% reduction by 2050. So to get to 80% average, some people have to do 100, right? Because not everybody's going to do 80%. So it was really interesting. I went around the company, literally our sales teams, our engineering teams, all over the place. And in one of the meetings, I had originally said, hey, let's go 100% by 2020. And in one of the meetings, one of the senior execs at the top of the company said, well, if we're going to go do this, why don't you just go now? I said, okay, let's go. So off we went, and we started to do immediately. We announced 2 years ago at Rio Plus 20, but we'd been working on it for about 6 or 9 months. And the key feedback from our CFO's office, our CFO at the time, he said to me, look, this has to be a simple model, because if it's super complex, it won't work. So the goal was to make it really simple. So if, I flew here, and my itinerary has how many pounds of carbon it cost me to come here, and then my team will get charged on a per ton price for the plane ticket and the tons of carbon. It goes into a central fund, And then we actually have an internal grant program, a carbon offset program, and a REC program. And then we'll actually place it in one of those different areas depending on sort of the input we get from both our carbon volume and from our internal stakeholders.
And is that global at this point? Is it every?
It is everywhere.
And how did that? How 2 years later? Well, first, how did that go over initially, and how is it? How are people dealing with it now?
What was amazing is, I mean, as you'd expect, you get some resistance because you're basically saying to somebody, "I'm going to tax you."
Right.
I mean, you call it a fee, and it is a fee. It's not a tax, but I mean, you're increasing somebody's costs. Right. And so the question immediately is, well, what's the value, right? So we had I'd say a lot of my job is almost like pitching at a VC. I mean, including this new merger, it's what's the value proposition? And the good news is we're 2 years in, and I think our returns on that program are far greater than I anticipated. It comes in the form of we're doing fuel cells and trying to think about how do you actually rethink the entire infrastructure of a data center. Right? That's pretty cool, right? And we're subsidizing our wind farm deals. So it's really taken off because it's changed consciousness. And then once consciousness changes, behavior changes. And that's the key. Like, you can't do all the work yourself as a sustainability officer. You got to get other people to change their consciousness, and then they'll do the work.
And once it's embedded in your P&L, you have the pain the first year, but then it's in there and you're used to it. But it must have made it real for all the people that manage those P&Ls.
Yeah, and it also gave you, I don't know how many people in the room struggle with this, but you want to have an audience with people who are doing really innovative and interesting stuff at your company, but it's often seen like this outlier thing, like, well, carbon or sustainability, it's sort of out with the citizenship team or some other team will take that accountability. And the core for the program is, no, it's everybody's accountability. Like if you work at Microsoft, you've got an accountability somehow, whether you know it or not. And that gives all of us on my team an opportunity to call you or email you really and say, hey, let's get together and discuss how this actually can be turned into an asset. Right? So you can imagine like in places where we buy these carbon offsets, the local teams are thrilled to have Microsoft investing in their local economies to improve water purification systems, right? It's a great opportunity for them to engage and think about things in a different way.
Do you have thoughts yet about how, or when you were pitching this internally, how you would apply the learnings at Microsoft at a city scale?
Oh, absolutely. In fact, you'll see the stuff from Daryl and that we're doing on our own campus. So basically, we've instrumented all of our campus and we're driving down our energy use. Well, our backyard or our front yard is Seattle. So we ended up saying, well, let's go see if we can do this at a city scale. I mean, we're 120 buildings plus and over 15 million square feet.
You're a small city.
We're a small city, but Seattle's a much bigger city, right? 90 million square feet in the downtown corridor. So we said, okay, let's actually think about how we take this to a city scale. And so we brought a whole bunch of partners with us. So again, it's not a Microsoft product. We're not trying to sell a SKU. We bring an ecosystem and we say, okay, let's instrument the city's buildings and see what kind of energy we can save. Right. And we're now, a year or two into that process. We've done the same thing in ISSI, where our headquarters in France are. And we're doing this in cities all over the world. And not just in energy now, we're doing it in transportation as well.
Yeah, well, it's really fascinating. So I'm going to go over to Elaine and take some questions from the virtual and physical audience.
Yeah, so we have a question about, via Twitter, via Bina Venkataraman. She used to be the executive office of the president, and she asks, how many cities will CityNext work with this year, next 5 years, and where are you working with which other tech companies?
So CityNext, we actually rolled it out a little over a year ago, and we're in every major city in the world. We've targeted well over 100 cities, and we've got about 700 solution scenarios and solutions that are in our catalog. So we're going to be in every city all over the world. And one of the great things about the opportunity of working at a company like Microsoft is once you can get something at a program that can scale, there are salespeople literally all over the world that can work with partners.
Another question that we have is about how typically siloed it is between the sustainability groups and the smart cities groups within tech companies. How have you guys been able to integrate that, and do you see this being a replicable trend for other tech companies?
Yeah, I mean, I'd like to think it is replicable, right? Because for us, the actual genesis of the CityNext team and the original papers we wrote came out of the sustainability team. So the people who have now sort of rejoined my team, literally, were people that we moved from the sustainability team into our public sector cities team. And it gets back to the same premise. It's hard to do sustainability without focusing on cities. So if any IT company wants to go down that road and have that journey, I'm happy to share pretty much exactly what we did, because I think it's inevitable if we're going to have impact as an industry.
What keeps you up at night?
Besides work volume, I'd say that the race. I mean, it is really exciting to see this massive innovation, like instrumenting of buses in Helsinki, which saves 5 to 10% of all the energy, because I now know, frankly, you and I could drive the same bus, right, and I could be far less efficient of a driver than you are. And historically, we'd have no idea. I'm gunning it and I'm slamming on the brakes. Now with sensors, they actually know which drivers are more environmentally efficient than others, right? So I think there's really cool innovation happening in all sorts of dimensions. The science is the scary part. I mean, we all read it in this room. I don't have to, unlike other areas, I don't have to actually tell you what's going on. It's pretty daunting sometimes. So the question is, how quickly can we innovate? And
do you think that this merger will help? There's a lot of skepticism from cities around software vendors, in that they're locked into long-term deals that, in some cases, just shouldn't be there today. And how do you feel you guys can sort of change that dialogue?
Well, I mean, I think there's a couple of things to think about it. So taking Microsoft aside for a second, right? The IT infrastructure landscape has dramatically changed in the 5 years or so that I've been doing this job. Right? With cloud infrastructure and cloud services, we see much lower switching costs, right, from any kind of system, legacy systems or current systems. So the amount of friction to move to optimal scenarios and solutions is way lower than it used to be. The other thing that we're seeing is much more interoperability. Right? So, Daryl will talk about it, I don't know if he'll say it this time, but he says, people would say, well, do you have such and such system? He's like, yeah, we got that. Like, we bought so many different buildings around Seattle that we had to do interoperability, right? And the IT industry as a whole, if you look at the deals that are happening, not just, Microsoft running on a bunch of Apple products and work with Apple and IBM, like, this interoperability is industry-wide, right? So the fears and concerns that we as an industry really created a decade, 2 decades ago, which is you are locked in, that paradigm is not over, but it is nearly over, right? And so cities should feel really excited, I would say, whether it's a Microsoft partner or frankly one of our competitors, the rate of innovation is astounding. Like, I'll say the thing that was most exciting when I came to this job is I started going through the catalog of solutions, and I'm like, wow. Like, I was sitting in the room yesterday and people saying, it would be good if we could do this or if we could do that. And I'm like, we actually can. I mean, this project's in India, this project's in Russia. But looking at it, to the question from online, since we're doing it globally, you get to harvest the innovation from wherever it comes. Yeah. So I think cities should be really excited. I think it is intimidating in some ways, but it's also really transformative.
Yeah. Well, that's great. I think we'll end on that note. Please join me in welcoming, at the very last minute, Rob Bernard from Microsoft.
Thank you. Thanks.